The courtroom that served justice for over 40 years just witnessed something that has never happened in American legal history. Not because of a fire alarm, not because of a medical emergency, not because of a security threat. Chief Judge Patricia Caldwell entered her own courtroom this morning at 9:17 a.m. and for 6 excruciating minutes, the former President of the United States refused to stand. Federal Marshal David Rodriguez told Reuters, the defendant remained seated while the judge stood at her bench. We had clear protocols, but no precedent for this situation. Translation: the constitutional foundation of our justice system just cracked in real time. I'm Barbara Green, and this is independent investigative journalism. Before we go any further, I need you to do something right now. Hit that subscribe button, click the notification bell. Leave a comment below telling me if you've ever seen anything like this in a courtroom. Share this video with everyone you know, because what I'm about to show you is spreading across federal courthouses nationwide. This is the only official channel documenting this constitutional crisis as it unfolds. What happened at 9:17 a.m. this morning is not about politics. It is about the bedrock principle that no one is above the law. Here's the core argument tonight in plain language. When basic courtroom protocol breaks down, judicial authority collapses. This isn't about partisan politics, it's about constitutional math. I'm going to walk you through the eyewitness accounts, the marshal's internal communications, and the legal experts who are calling this a point of no return, so you can see exactly how we got here and who's about to eat the cost. Court reporter Helen Martinez has worked federal court for 18 years. She told the Washington Post, "I have never seen anything like it." The silence was deafening. You could hear people shifting in their seats. The judge just stood there, waiting. Everyone was waiting. The marshals looked at each other like they didn't know what to do. Let that sink in. Federal marshals, trained to handle the most dangerous criminals in America, did not know what to do when someone refused to follow basic courtroom etiquette. Internal radio communications obtained by this channel reveal Marshal Rodriguez asking his supervisor, "Do we approach? Do we wait? What are the protocols here?" The supervisor's response, "Stand by. We're in uncharted territory." Think about that for a moment. Uncharted territory. In a system built on centuries of legal precedent, we just entered uncharted territory because someone refused to stand up. And it gets worse. The tradition of rising when a judge enters dates back to medieval English courts in the 12th century. Not as empty ceremony, as constitutional recognition that justice sits above personal ego. For 800 years, this protocol has meant one thing: no individual, regardless of power or position, stands above the law in the courtroom. Dr. Sarah Weinstein, constitutional law professor at Georgetown, told CNN this morning, "When you refuse to stand for a judge, you are rejecting the fundamental principle of judicial authority. You are saying that your personal status supersedes the institution of justice itself. That is how democracies die. Not with revolution, with disrespect." Translation: this was not about courtesy. This was about constitutional order. And this morning was not the first time. Federal court records show 3 previous incidents of protocol violations in the past 14 months. March 2024. Defendant remained seated during opening statements in Miami Federal Court. August 2024. Refused to rise for jury entry in Washington, D.C. January 2025. Interrupted judge mid-sentence in New York Southern District. Each time, court officials accommodated the behavior. Each time, they moved forward. Each time, they set precedent for what was acceptable. Legal historian Professor James Mitchell at Yale Law School explained to the Washington Post, "Judicial deference is the invisible foundation of our entire legal system. When judges begin accommodating defiant behavior, they are not being patient. They are being complicit in the erosion of their own authority." Let me show you the domino chain that legal experts are tracking. First domino: individual refuses basic courtroom protocol. Second domino: marshals hesitate to enforce because defendant has political status. Third domino: Judge accommodates the violation to avoid confrontation. Fourth domino. Other defendants see that rules are negotiable based on who you are. Translation: equal justice under law just became a suggestion. Court clerk Maria Santos has worked Judge Caldwell's courtroom for 12 years. She told this channel the atmosphere has completely changed. Staff members are nervous. We used to know exactly what to expect. Now we prepare for anything. My supervisor told us to document everything because we might need it later. Think about that. Court staff are now documenting normal proceedings because normal no longer exists. The Federal Court Security Office reported a 47% increase in protocol violations since January 2025. Not disruptions, not outbursts, protocol violations, defendants arriving late, refusing to remove hats, talking during proceedings, ignoring direct judicial instructions. Chief Marshal Robert Kim told the Administrative Office of Courts, "We are seeing a fundamental shift in respect for judicial authority. Officers are spending more time on basic compliance issues that were never problems before. The chain of command is becoming unclear when enforcement involves high-profile individuals." Translation: the people trained to enforce court order are confused about whether they still have authority to enforce court order. But wait, there's something they're not telling you about what those martial communications really revealed. Internal radio transcripts from this morning's show Marshal Rodriguez asking, "Sir, do we have legal authority to compel compliance with standing protocol if the defendant refuses?" The response from Marshal Supervisor Janet Powell, "Negative. Standing protocol is not legally enforceable. It falls under judicial discretion." Let that sink in. The foundation of courtroom respect that has existed for 8 centuries is not actually legally enforceable. It depends entirely on voluntary compliance and mutual respect for institutional authority. Professor Weinstein explained, "The entire judicial system operates on consent. The defendant consents to recognize the court's authority. The court consents to treat the defendant with dignity. When one side withdraws consent, the other side has very limited options without escalating to constitutional crisis." Now watch what happens next. Here is exactly what happened during those 6 minutes that changed American jurisprudence forever. 9:17 a.m., Judge Caldwell enters. Security cameras show every person in the gallery rising, except one. The defendant remains seated, arms crossed, looking directly at the judge. 9:18 a.m., Judge Caldwell stands at her bench for 43 seconds. Court reporter Helen Martinez later described the silence as suffocating. Everyone waiting, everyone watching, everyone knowing they were witnessing something that had never happened before. 9:19 a.m., Marshal Rodriguez takes 2 steps toward the defendant, then stops. Radio communication transcript. Rodriguez to control, subject is non-compliant with standing protocol. Request guidance, control to Rodriguez, stand by for supervisor guidance. 9:20 a.m., Marshal Supervisor Powell enters the courtroom, approaches Rodriguez. Whispers something inaudible. Rodriguez steps back to his original position. 9:21 a.m., Judge Caldwell makes an unprecedented decision. She sits down, she begins proceedings while both she and the defendant are seated. Constitutional law professor James Mitchell told NBC News, "In that moment, 800 years of judicial protocol died. The court adapted to defiance rather than enforcing compliance." 9:22 a.m. Proceedings continue. The defendant's attorney objects to the irregular seating arrangement. Judge Caldwell responds, "The court will accommodate all parties to ensure proceedings can continue." Defense attorney Sarah Chen later told reporters, "I had never seen a judge accommodate defiant behavior. I objected because it set a precedent that terrified me." 9:23 a.m., Marshal Rodriguez receives final radio communication. All units stand down. Maintain observation positions only. Do not engage unless direct threat to security. Translation: Federal law enforcement was ordered to ignore a violation of court protocol because enforcing it might create a bigger problem than allowing it. Federal Marshal Rodriguez has served for 15 years. He told this channel, "I have removed people from courtrooms for talking too loud, for not turning off cell phones, for chewing gum. But I was told to stand down when someone refused to show basic respect to a federal judge. That goes against everything I was trained to do." Think about what that means for every marshal, every bailiff, every court security officer in America. The people responsible for maintaining order just learned that some people are above the rules. Constitutional law professor James Mitchell was watching the live stream from his office at Columbia Law School. He said, "I immediately called my colleague at Yale and said we just witnessed a constitutional crisis in real time." When courts begin accommodating defiance instead of enforcing compliance, judicial authority becomes optional. Let me tell you about Rebecca Martinez, a court stenographer in Chicago Federal Court. 3 days after the standing incident, a defendant in her courtroom refused to remove his baseball cap. When the marshal moved to enforce the rule, the defendant said, "If he doesn't have to stand, I don't have to take off my hat." The marshal looked at the judge. The judge looked at the marshal. Nobody knew what to do anymore. Rebecca told her husband that night, "The rules don't mean anything anymore. Some people follow them, some people don't. We just make it up as we go." Her family started receiving threatening phone calls after she spoke to local news. Anonymous callers telling her to keep quiet about court proceedings. Her 15-year-old daughter asked, "Mum, why are people mad at you for doing your job?" That is what intimidation of court personnel looks like. That is how judicial independence dies. And Rebecca Martinez is not alone. In the last 3 weeks, 17 court stenographers, 23 bailiffs, and 8 court clerks across 12 federal districts have reported similar protocol violations, defendants citing the standing incident as justification for ignoring court rules. Federal Court Security Director Patricia Hernandez issued an internal memo obtained by this channel. Court personnel are reporting increased anxiety, confusion about enforcement protocols, and concerns about personal safety when attempting to maintain courtroom order. The precedent set by accommodation of defiant behavior is cascading through the federal system. Translation: fear is replacing respect in American courtrooms. Here's the irony that should make everyone angry. Enhanced court security measures implemented after January 6th were designed to protect judges and court personnel from external threats. Metal detectors, bulletproof glass, increased marshal presence, all to ensure that justice could be administered safely. Those same security measures are now being used by marshals who are afraid to enforce basic courtroom rules because they don't know if they have institutional support for enforcement. Security was supposed to protect the courts from chaos. Instead, security is frozen while chaos unfolds from within. The law of unintended consequences is not theoretical. It is playing out in federal courtrooms across America every single day. Let that sink in. The institutions designed to protect democracy are being paralyzed by their own security protocols, and this is where it becomes undeniable. The Federal Court Security Office tracks incidents in all 94 federal districts. The numbers are staggering. Security incidents involving protocol violations have increased by 127% since January 2025. Not violent disruptions, not weapons, protocol violations, defendants refusing to stand, defendants refusing to remove hats, defendants interrupting judges, defendants walking out during proceedings. The Administrative Office of Courts is calling it an epidemic of institutional disrespect. Chief Judge Maria Santos of the Ninth Circuit told the Federal Judges Association in an emergency meeting last Thursday, "We are losing control of our own courtrooms, not to violence, not to threats, to defiance. When basic respect becomes optional, judicial authority becomes meaningless." The transcript from that meeting reveals something more alarming. 23 federal judges discussed early retirement. 14 judges requested additional security, not for physical protection, but for institutional protection. They want enforcement protocols that their marshals are afraid to use. Chief Judge Robert Kim of the Eastern District of Virginia said, "How do I maintain order when my own security personnel ask permission to enforce the most basic courtroom rules?" How do I sentence defendants who openly mock judicial authority while my marshals stand by and watch? Translation: Federal judges are discovering they have no practical authority beyond what defendants voluntarily grant them. This isn't about politics, it's about math. The federal judiciary processes 1.4 million cases annually. 94 districts, 700 active judges. Every case depends on mutual respect for institutional authority. When respect breaks down, the entire system breaks down. Harvard Law School professor Elena Rodriguez published a study 3 weeks ago comparing protocol violations in American courts to similar patterns in failed democracies. Her research examined Hungary, Poland, Venezuela, and Turkey between 2010 and 2020. Professor Rodriguez found identical patterns. First, political figures begin defying court protocols. Second, enforcement agencies hesitate to act. Third, judicial authority adapts to accommodate defiance. Fourth, ordinary defendants begin copying the behavior. Fifth, courts lose practical authority to maintain order. She told the American Bar Association, "The American federal judiciary is currently in stage 4 of a 5-stage process that historically ends with judicial collapse. Stage 5 is when courts can no longer function because no one respects their authority." Think about that. We are 1 stage away from judicial collapse, according to someone who has studied this exact pattern in multiple countries. The enforcement crisis is spreading beyond protocol violations. U.S. Marshals in 6 districts have reported defendants refusing to comply with basic security procedures. Metal detector refusal, bag search refusal, contraband removal refusal, all citing the standing incident as precedent for optional compliance. Marshal Training Academy Director James Powell issued a confidential memo to all district chiefs. Officers are requesting clarification on enforcement authority for basic security and protocol violations. Current guidance from headquarters is inadequate for field operations. Officers report confusion about when they have authority to compel compliance versus when they must seek judicial approval for enforcement. Translation: The people responsible for court security don't know when they're allowed to do their jobs. The American Bar Association commissioned an emergency study of judicial independence. Preliminary findings show 68% of federal judges report decreased confidence in their ability to maintain courtroom order. 42% report considering early retirement due to institutional degradation. Retired Supreme Court Justice Patricia Hernandez warned the Senate Judiciary Committee, "When judges cannot enforce basic courtroom rules, they cannot enforce complex legal judgments. When marshals cannot compel respect for judicial authority, they cannot compel respect for judicial decisions. The entire enforcement chain is breaking down in real time." Let me show you what this looks like in practice. Last Tuesday in Seattle Federal Court, a defendant refused to provide identification during arraignment. The marshal asked the judge for guidance. The judge asked the defendant to voluntarily comply. The defendant said no. Proceedings continued without identification verification. That defendant was released on recognizance to an address that may not exist under a name that may not be real, because no one in the courtroom had authority to compel the most basic compliance with the most basic procedure. This is not abstract constitutional theory. This is operational collapse of the justice system happening right now in federal courthouses across America. And it gets worse. Constitutional law scholars are using the phrase tipping point. Not metaphorically, mathematically. If protocol violations continue spreading at the current rate, 60% of federal courts will be operating without functional authority within 18 months. Georgetown law professor Elena Rodriguez ran projection models based on current trends. Her findings are terrifying. If judicial authority continues eroding at the documented rate, the federal court system will reach critical dysfunction by fall 2026. Critical dysfunction means courts can hold proceedings but cannot enforce decisions. Think about what that means: a justice system that can talk but cannot act. Judges who can issue orders but cannot compel compliance. Marshals who can observe violations but cannot stop them. This exact pattern destroyed judicial independence in Venezuela between 2015 and 2017. Professor Maria Santos at Yale Law School documented the process. Month 1, political figures begin ignoring court protocols. Month 6, protocol violations spread to ordinary defendants. Month 12, courts lose practical enforcement authority. Month 18, judicial decisions become suggestions rather than commands. Professor Santos told the Senate Judiciary Committee, Venezuela went from functional democracy to authoritarian rule in 18 months using this exact playbook. Constitutional crisis doesn't happen overnight. It happens through systematic erosion of institutional respect until institutions can no longer function. Federal Judge Robert Kim of the Fourth Circuit announced last Friday he is considering early retirement after 22 years on the bench. His statement to the Baltimore Sun was extraordinary. I cannot in good conscience continue presiding over proceedings where my authority depends on the defendant's mood. When basic respect becomes optional, justice becomes impossible. Let me tell you about Judge Kim's specific situation. Last month, during a sentencing hearing, the defendant interrupted him 7 times, called him incompetent, and walked out during proceedings. The marshals looked to Judge Kim for guidance. Judge Kim looked back at the marshals. Nobody moved. The defendant left. Sentencing was postponed indefinitely. Judge Kim told his staff, I spent 2 decades believing that institutional authority was backed by institutional power. I was wrong. Authority only exists when people choose to recognize it. And people are choosing not to. The economic implications are staggering. The Federal Court Administration estimates that dysfunction-related delays are already costing the justice system $400 million annually. Contract disputes that cannot be resolved, criminal cases that cannot be concluded, civil rights violations that cannot be addressed. Financial markets are beginning to price in judicial uncertainty. Legal insurance premiums have increased 37% since January 2025. Corporate attorneys are advising clients to avoid federal court whenever possible because outcomes are becoming unpredictable. Translation: when courts lose authority, business loses confidence in legal contracts. When business loses confidence in legal contracts, the entire economic system becomes unstable. This is where it gets worse. International allies are questioning American judicial independence. The European Union issued a formal diplomatic inquiry about US court dysfunction. The United Kingdom suspended 3 extradition agreements pending review of American judicial effectiveness. Ambassador Sarah Chen told the State Department, our allies are asking whether American courts can actually enforce judgments. When foreign governments question our judicial system, our international agreements become worthless. Think about that. America's global leadership depends on other countries trusting our institutions. If they stop trusting our courts, they stop trusting our treaties, our trade agreements, our diplomatic commitments. Constitutional scholar Professor James Mitchell issued a warning that every American should understand. We are approaching the point of no return for constitutional norms. Once institutional respect collapses below a critical threshold, it cannot be restored through normal democratic processes. It requires either constitutional crisis or authoritarian intervention. Translation: fix this now through democratic means, or watch it get fixed later through undemocratic means. The timeline for action is shrinking. Based on current trends, experts estimate we have between 6 and 14 weeks before protocol violations become so widespread that courts cannot function effectively. 14 weeks to save judicial independence, 14 weeks to prevent constitutional collapse, 14 weeks to choose between democracy and authoritarianism. That is not hyperbole, that is math. Here's the accountability question I want you to answer in the comments. Do you believe that anyone in America should be above basic courtroom protocol? Yes or no? Not a complicated question, not a partisan question, a constitutional question. Because this story isn't over. It's being written right now in federal courtrooms across America. Every day that passes without accountability is another day that judicial authority becomes optional. Every protocol violation that goes unenforced is another step toward constitutional collapse. Here's what I need you to do. Contact your representatives. Not tomorrow, not next week, today. Tell them you expect federal courts to have the authority to enforce basic courtroom rules. Tell them judicial independence depends on institutional respect. Tell them you understand the difference between political disagreement and constitutional crisis. The phone numbers are on your screen. The email addresses are in the description. This is not about politics. This is about whether America will have a functioning justice system next year. Hit that subscribe button and click the notification bell, because I will be documenting every stage of this constitutional crisis. Every protocol violation, every judicial accommodation, every step towards system collapse. This is the only official channel covering the institutional breakdown happening in real time. Share this video with everyone you know, because the mainstream media is not connecting these dots. They're covering individual incidents as isolated events. They're missing the pattern. They're missing the timeline. They're missing the mathematical certainty of what comes next if nothing changes. I'll be here in the comments reading every single response, because this community is how we document what's really happening to American institutions. Your voice matters, your accountability matters, your willingness to demand that institutions function properly matters. The Federal Judges Association meets again next Thursday. 28 judges are expected to announce early retirement if protocol enforcement doesn't improve. The Administrative Office of Courts is drafting emergency guidelines for martial behavior during protocol violations. The Department of Justice is reviewing enforcement authority for court security personnel. All of this is happening because people like you are demanding accountability. All of this matters because judicial independence is not abstract. It affects your contracts, your rights, your access to justice when you need it most. This story is not about politics. It is about people. Real judges considering retirement. Real marshals confused about their authority. Real court staff afraid to enforce basic rules.